to feel free to use the Q&A function if you've got questions for the panel. What we're going to do today is spend a bit of time on Wales, a bit of a presentation on Wales. There'll be an opportunity to ask some quick questions, some quick responses. Then we're going to whiz over to Scotland. We're going to have a bit of a presentation on Scotland, and we're also going to then have a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up to a broader panel, and we'll be keen for people to talk at that time and to raise their questions, etc. So that's the technical detail. Any queries or questions? I think there's now live transcription. I think we're all good to go on that front now. Any issues, do shout, but otherwise I think we'll get into the event now, and really pleased to spend the next hour and a half or so on thinking about these things. We're really pleased as a Civic University Network to be holding this event to look in much more detail at the Welsh approach to the Civic mission and also the Scottish one. Being able to look across the 4 nations is really important to us at the network. It enables us to learn from best practice and also the different approaches and methods and techniques and conversations that are happening across different places, because the word civic obviously can mean, does take different forms and different roles in different places. Here in England, the civic mission is very much aligned to things like the levelling up agenda and those sorts of conversations. But obviously we know in Wales, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this sort of real focus on the mission aspect of it, and also the sort of the narrative that's very much based around future generations, which is an area that I've certainly watched from a distance. In terms of, it's quite inspiring, that sort of lens through which I think the Welsh policy conversation happens, and one in which many different places can learn from. Scotland, of course, we'll hear in much more detail today, is more around sort of the national performance framework and very focused on particular issues and themes, particularly around sustainability, etc. So again, different approaches, different landscapes, but very much amongst the same objectives. And that's what we're really looking forward to hearing about today. So the presentations that we'll have are really going to be our colleagues from Wales and Scotland talking us through the sort of learnings, the challenges, the dynamics, what's happening and what have been some of the challenges to the civic mission, but also what does the future look like, what might we learn from the different scenarios and the different approaches, and take that back to our own institutions as civic universities, but also potentially as policymakers and funders, etc. So that's the shape and mix of today. We're going to first travel to Wales, from the comforts of our own homes, where I'm really pleased. We're really excited today to have Professor Claire Taylor from Wrexham, Glyndŵr, coming to talk to us, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Professor of Education. It's a bit of a team effort here for the Wales side of things. We've got Claire, but also Nina Riddle, who's the head of public policy engagement, also at Wrexham, Glyndŵr, and then Ed Bridges joining us from Cardiff University, and Ed being the Public Affairs and Civic Missions Manager. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand it over to Wales to take us through their presentation. Over to you, I think, Claire, to begin with.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie. Diolch and bore da pawb, croeso. Delighted to be here to talk to you all a little bit today around how civic mission is landing within universities in Wales. This is a team effort. I'm going to kick off and give a little bit of policy context. Nina, who works with me here at Wrexham Glyndŵr as our head of public policy engagement, will talk through some specific examples of what we're doing at Wrexham Glyndŵr in particular. We'll hand over to Ed, who will give an insight into what's going on down in Cardiff, in the south of the nation. And then I'll just wrap up with just a couple of thoughts around challenges and further opportunities as well going forwards. And on this first slide here, on the right hand side, you can see that wheel, and this is a very important sort of landing slide for us. Around the edge of that wheel, you have the 7 goals of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The black part just to the next sort of wheel in are the 5 ways of working linked to that Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and in the middle there is the co-created Universities Wales Civic Mission kind of framework and key foci there, which all universities in Wales have signed up to. But that policy context around wellbeing of future generations is incredibly important. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please. Great. So two or three things that are really, really important to us in Wales and which are really shaping not only how universities respond to civic mission, but actually a whole gamut really of public sector and third sector responses. So the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales, which was came into being well, 7 years ago now, it's been around quite a long time, was all about securing a better future for our young people. It's exactly what it says on the tin. We have a Future Generations Commissioner, Sophie Howe, who heads up this work, and a Future Generations Office. And all public sector bodies have a have to have a commitment to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. You've got there on the right hand side the key areas which the Act focuses on, about global responsibility, prosperous Wales, resilient Wales, healthier Wales, more equal Wales, cohesive communities, and a lot of work around culture and the Welsh language. So these are the 7 areas of focus, as I've said. Interestingly, universities, because we're kind of on the cusp of being public sector, we are not legally bound to engage with the Act, which is an interesting loophole, we think, in terms of the Act as a driver. However, certainly at Wrexham, and I know at many of the universities, we've made it our business to insert ourselves in this work. So therefore, we have a very good, strong policy context to work within. The second bullet point there, the Tertiary Education and Research Wales Bill, we're moving away from HEFQ, the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales, and moving towards a new commission for Tertiary Education and Research, or CETA. That will have oversight for all post-16 provision across Wales. And civic mission is one of the 9 strategic duties of that new commission, and we're delighted that it's been written into that bill and written into the work going forwards. So that will mean that there'll be a much stronger policy focus, and we're hoping a funding focus as well. I've talked about the Universities Wales Civic Mission Framework and the network there, which we've all signed up to. And also the research agenda is incredibly important. So the vision for Wales in terms of research and innovation has embraced aspects of civic mission, and in particular place-based work and place-based funding mechanisms, which again we're hoping to leverage going forwards. The Hazel Corn Review and the PSET strategic vision, that is the kind of background work that was done to inform the new Tertiary Education and Research Bill and the movement towards the new commission. But you know, the key takeaways really for the policy environment are the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which all public sector bodies have to sign up to, and also the new commission going forwards. And if we can move on to the next one. Thank you. Just a little bit about what we're doing up in Wrexham, and I'll hand over to Nina very soon for some specific examples. So our mission is to work together with partners to end social inequality across North Wales by 2030. And the key thing I want to point out in terms of our approach at Wrexham is that this is about partnership. You could almost ignore the fact that it says civic mission. This is a partnership strategy. And this was co-created with partners. We literally sat around the table with significant public sector and third sector leaders in particular across North Wales. And we discussed together, you know, what are our shared challenges? What can we do together to make things better? And the big shared challenge was around ending social inequality. I and myself and Nina led on a lot of this work in terms of co-creating the strategy, and the discussions I was having with, you know, council leaders, housing associations, the health board, voluntary associations, it was all focused on social inequalities, poverty, you know, poor housing, poor health, all of those sorts of things. And if you see very deliberately on there, we've couched this in terms of being useful to our partners. Our aim is to be useful to you, these are the people we're working with, by working with and for you, innovating, co-creating, testing and delivering new approaches. And we've landed on 3 key areas: leadership, governance and whole systems working, particularly systems leadership and systems thinking, building community resilience, which has been very important post-COVID, and keeping well, so the whole healthy agenda. But this is very much about working with and working for, if you like, a kind of you know, service and servant type approach. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. And just in terms of how we're actually doing that, we're using the Design Council loop there in terms of discovering, defining, developing, delivering the issues that we're looking at. And the key thing is to spend time on actually thinking about problems and not jumping immediately to solutions. So again, co-creating with our partners, actually identifying those shared challenges. And just underneath there in terms of outcomes, we've got there again the wellbeing of future generations wheel there with the 7 goals, but also the sustainable development goals. And everything that we do at Wrexham Glyndŵr University is mapped not only against the wellbeing of future generations outcomes and goals, but also against the sustainable development goals as well in terms of looking for impact. So I'm going to hand over to Nina, who's going to briefly give you a whistle-stop tour of some key projects that we're involved in. Thanks, Nina.
Good morning, Borodar, everyone, and thank you very much, Claire. It's lovely to be here this morning. So what I'm going to do is give you a flavour of what this feels and looks like in Wrexham and how we're working with partners in many, many different ways and communities as well. So the first one is we've selected a few flavours of each of the projects underpinning those 3 priority areas. And one of the first ones is the leadership area. We, as Claire said, has developed a real expertise with partners, not alone in isolation, with lots of partners in all the sectors that Claire talked about, but also with communities in systems leadership and systems thinking. So how do we change the system for positive social change, and how we look left and right, not up and down in a linear sort of way. So we've really enabled that through working with partners. We developed again through the conversation with partners, a North Wales Public Service Lab, which is a space and place to bring together lots of partners. And the 3 core priority areas for that is to develop a community of systems leaders that think and work and are educated and trained in all the ways of working and thinking. We deliver masterclasses and education programs. The second area is how we enable conversations, and that's through many, many different ways. So we host cafes. Last week, for example, we had the head of partnership and development for Warm Wales coming to talk about fuel poverty and a provocation, and lots of partners came together and we explore how we can work together differently. So it's really about unpicking the collective challenge and the purpose of what we're doing and how we can work together to change the system in which we're working for the benefit of the communities in which we're part of and we serve. And then the final area goes back to what Claire was saying, is the commitment to useful work, and that takes many facets really. And one of the things that through the Future Generations Act, the mechanism set up to deliver that is called Public Service Boards, and there's 19 across Wales, and we work with the 4 across all of North Wales, particularly in depth with our local Wrexham and Flintshire Public Service Boards, to really help enable how we work together collaboratively in those 5 new ways of working, enabled through systems leadership and working in lots of different ways and delivering projects together. The other ways we've enabled useful work is the model you can see there is our co-designed North Wales systems thinking model. So how do we think about these challenges and what do we do, taking it through different staged processes, and this is always evolving. This is a constantly evolving approach. And then finally, one of the other pieces of useful work as a real flavour is we've engaged all of our students in different capacities in the work we do, and we've developed a magazine with our graphic design students around the public service boards, what's happening, particularly another useful and really amazing project has been working with lots of partners across the region to develop a new insight and research partnership, bringing all the gifts of partners together to develop the wellbeing assessments which are needed every 5 years of the legislation. So it really brings the university's expertise to bear with that space as well. So that's a flavour of that. So I'd move on to the next slide. I'm navigating you all around North Wales. Community resilience, again, this is a second priority area. And this is a huge focus for us, is storytelling and the importance of conversation and active listening, and how we engage the stories in our communities to shape our civic mission and what we do in public services to improve and work together differently. We've worked with community resilience with 30 members within a 3 communities across North East Wales. I've now got translation. There we are. Okay, there we are. That was interesting. So we worked with 30 members of the community, and it was all about public narrative and understanding the story of what matters in our communities around health, wellbeing and social inequality, and that shapes the projects we do as well. And then what we did is we used the skills and the understanding of systems leadership and public narrative, so your stories that matter to you, why, and how we move to change, for children and young people, 49 of them in 3 high schools with the Children's Commissioner, and it was really groundbreaking with the work we did. And I think the learning from this one for me was very much, now we've merged these 2 projects and we're pooling resources from loads of different partners, not from the funding we have through the Higher Education Funding Council, but we've leveraged through partnership and trust that we've built, pooling lots of partners coming together to create a bigger project across the region that can be a real enabler for change around how we're creative and use storytelling at the front end of changing the way we think and work, and shaping policy as well. So that's a really exciting piece of work. Next slide, please. Oh, that's gone backwards, forward, sorry. And the next slide is about Children's University. Again, many will know what this is, but we're very much working with Cardiff in this capacity with twin tracking. Children's University for us is an innovative vehicle that how we can think about intergenerational learning, aspirational learning for children and young people, public health messages getting through to our children and young people as well, but really enabling virtual schools as well, where actually children are not in existing academic settings, actually those that go to different mechanisms like youth forums and things like that, where actually you can engage a love of learning that's outside and really drive aspiration in learning as we go forward. So that's a pilot project, and we're looking to roll that out across the region in the future. So that's really exciting, with 140 children and 9 schools. Next slide, please. And then this is one of our other key projects under the Keeping Well priority area. Is we are on a journey to become the first trace-informed university, and that's trauma and adverse childhood experiences informed university. So how we shape our policies, processes and people and the way we work and think to use a trauma-informed lens. And that's having compassion and kindness at the heart of public services. So we've got a really innovative partnership with the ACES Adverse Childhood Experiences hub for Wales. And we're really driving a different way of working and thinking. And I think for me, the learning from this is how you really create that innovative partnership with a clear purpose. Their purpose as a hub in Wales is to really drive becoming a compassionate Wales. And as a university, we care passionately about it. We brought those purposes together and we're really driving a different way of working. We're using the university's approach to unlock what does it mean to be trauma-informed across a community and across society? So working with housing, youth justice, education. And again, going back to key learnings for me is how we leverage the assets that are already within our gift. And the animation you can see there's a little, we can try and put it in the chat actually, Sarah, you might be able to do that. An animation created by our students to think very basically, what does trauma mean and how does it affect people differently? And this can be used from foundation phase through to anyone to understand what trauma means and how it impacts on us. And it's a great place to start. We launched this in January. It was one of our brilliant GTA PhD students that did that. And our students created the animation as well. And it was UNICEF and Welsh Government launched it in January, and it was seen as really groundbreaking. So I'd really, it's a really useful thing to engage with and a great tool. And we're doing lots of work with lots of partners to how we enable that approach to happen, including 2025, which is at the bottom there. Next slide, please. I told you it was a whistle-stop tour. What I want to do is that's just a very soundbite flavour of some of the projects we're doing on the ground and what it looks and feels like. I just want to touch on some of the challenges we've got in a Wrexham setting, and then I'll hand over to Ed to talk about Cardiff. Is for us, the challenge is always keeping on a real path of a clear purpose and an understanding of your place and space, and that's through data and evidence, understanding the stories that motivates people and enabling the action to make a difference. So it's a really sort of holistic whole systems way of thinking and working, but it's different for many people. So you have to keep educating, talking about this, and the language will change as we start thinking in whole systems ways. How we look long term and build trust and relationships, it does take time, and it takes time to maintain those relationships. I, as a professional, are in lots of different partnerships working together. It's how we enable academics to have the time and capacity to build those relationships alongside me, that's not measured, that are not about quick wins. Actually, this is Civic Mission is about a long-term focus. It's not getting quick wins, and it's difficult to measure the relationships that are built, that are imperative to build the trust as we move forward, and bigger projects, which I think we've really evidenced through the work we're doing. A perpetual issue is how we measure impact and evidence, because we can't compare apples with apples, because rightly Civic Mission is very place and specific to places, but how do we measure partnership and creativeness? That's where I'm and who we're measuring for and why. And I think we've got some real tools we're exploring now to enable us to be innovative in how we measure the work and the impact particularly having on the communities and the goals that we're working towards. Another challenge for us is the power of storytelling. One of the things that we really need to do is own the narrative of our own institutions, but also of that of our communities. And one of the things we're really have been forward thinking of is trying to get the stories of our partners, of our children and people, of our people across and citizens across North Wales, for those stories and those voices to change and shape the system as well. And we've been a real enabler in that space as well, using those different lenses and language, which gives us the richness that we need to achieve whole systems change. So it's really important that we use that and own those narratives. And I think the final challenge, and this is one to throw out really, and if Civic Mission is the answer, then what's the question? What's the collective challenge we're trying to tackle in a space or place? And for me, when in universities we talk about third mission, but actually I think that sort of knocks it down to something that's not as important as others. And I think for me, is Civic Mission the mission of a university? Because if it's not about social mobility and education not at the core of that, then what are universities actually about? So I think sometimes it's about shifting it on its head and rethinking Civic Mission to be very much at the heart and the driver of the mission around a university's approach to supporting the communities in which they serve. So there's some of my challenges. There are many more, which I'm sure will come out in discussion, but I'm going to hand to Ed now to talk about Cardiff. So over to you, Ed.
Diolch, Nina. Bore da pawb, diolch am y gyfle I siarad bore yma. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to pick my lead up really from Nina in terms of what is a university's mission, and just talk a little bit about how Cardiff University has interpreted our civic mission and our wider responsibility to the people and communities we serve. Like a lot of universities, Cardiff thought that our strategic focus for civic mission was great, but then COVID came along and blew it all apart. And as a result of that, during the middle period of 2020, we revisited and refreshed our civic mission strategy to try and ensure that we were playing our part in Wales's response to the huge societal challenges of the pandemic, just as Cardiff University played its part in responding to the major societal challenges of the 20th century. And that resulted in a short but very intense period of engagement with colleagues in the university, as well as key external stakeholders such as Welsh Government and the Future Generations Commissioner. And we ended up coalescing around these three priorities that are set out on the slide. The first centres around our role in catalysing Wales's green recovery post-COVID, echoing ambitions from the Welsh Government. And it sees us ramping up our commitment to projects like the one photographed on the left there, which is a green social prescribing project in the Cynon Valley, which is our Civic Mission flagship project for this current academic year. The second priority sees us play our part in the wider skills agenda in Wales. Some of this is structural in its focus and sees us work with the Future Generations Commissioner, looking at how policy ambitions around skills are being delivered and can be improved. But it also sees us enhance our projects around schools engagement, STEMs, physics mentoring, those sorts of projects. And the final priority is around community engagement, particularly on looking at how we can do things differently post-COVID. Much of it building on our long-established commitment to the Grangetown ward of Cardiff, where we've worked with the local community to develop a local park pavilion and use that as a base to deliver a whole range of initiatives, including the one pictured on the right there, which is a pilot project seeking to involve children and young people to revitalise local facilities. So that's the good news, but I set it out not to show off how great Cardiff University is, but because it's really apparent to me that these initiatives need to be the start of a conversation and not the totality of it. As I said, we developed these projects and priorities very quickly post-COVID, but I think there's a huge amount of work to do over the next 18 months or so to think about what happens in the next phase, not just of our civic mission, but of civic mission for universities in Wales as a whole, and how we can tie those different streams together into a single, even more focused, even more ambitious vision. And I think that requires us to be much better engaged with the communities we serve, as well as with our own staff and students. And as Nina and Claire have said, we do that in the context of a changing Welsh policy landscape with the TUR bill, with the emergence of funding through Research Wales Innovation Fund, both of which are really important because they put universities' civic mission onto a statutory basis, ensuring that we've got external resource to deliver it. But I think we also have to manage expectations about how much we can achieve and how quickly because of the challenges we face, which brings me neatly onto my second slide, where I'm going to focus on three specific challenges, but also to try and suggest some solutions to them. Firstly, and I don't think this is unique to Wales by any means, universities are increasingly being urged to work together, and many of us are indeed seeking to do so, at the very least on a project-by-project basis. But I think it's very easy to underestimate just how difficult it can be to work together on shared goals when we're often also in competition with each other. For students, for research funding, for regional investment, you know, we're competing against each other in one sphere and then being expected to collaborate in another. And I think ultimately the challenge to that is a long-term one about cultures within our institutions and in the sector as a whole. And to be clear, it's a challenge we have to grapple with. We can't expect others to do it for us. My sense is that that's beginning to happen and institutions are working together more and more. And I think we need to be encouraged, and we need to encourage each other to keep that going and to see how that collaboration can be scaled up over time. Secondly, and slightly related, I think universities may be applying for civic mission funding from UK government and from Welsh government sources at the same time. And we have to consider the political risk that by doing so, we're sometimes seen by one partner to be favouring the other. You know, we will all have experience of taking a minister from one government to visit a project, only to discover a few days later that we've ruffled feathers and put people's back out because ministers from another tier of government haven't been invited to something similar. And it's perhaps a slightly forlorn hope to expect different and competing governments to collaborate themselves in identifying their civic mission expectations for the sector. I think we've got to be patient with them when it comes to collaboration, just as we ask them to be patient with us. But again, I think there is a point here around culture and making sure that universities don't feel that we're being asked to pick a side when it comes to our civic agenda. And finally, I think assumptions are too often made about the size of institutions having an impact on our civic mission approach. And in my experience, those assumptions are usually wrong. Larger institutions such as mine, contrary to belief, don't have endless pots of money and enormous teams to deliver civic agenda, but we often face the assumption that we do, and we have to manage expectations. Equally, smaller institutions can often be extremely ambitious in their approach to civic agenda, and I think Wrexham are a really good example of that. To find a positive note, my experience is that the very best collaborations see larger and smaller institutions playing to their strengths. You know, only do what only you can do and focus on delivering your bit really well. And that often means that the very best partnerships might be on thematic projects rather than geographic ones. And Nina's already mentioned Wrexham Glyndŵr's involvement in the Children's University in Wrexham and Flintshire. Here in Cardiff, we've been involved in a pilot project with Cardiff Council. And I think there's much that Cardiff and Wrexham can learn from each other about what's worked and what hasn't, even if the areas that we serve are very different and our institutions have different strengths. And so to finish, my key message would be, I think there's reason for an awful lot of optimism in Wales about the civic agenda because of the successes that we've seen through some of the RWIF funded projects and because of the government focus on the civic agenda. but it's an area that I think needs to be nurtured and supported by institutions and by partners in government and civil society, so that Welsh civic mission doesn't collapse under the weight of expectation. And with that, I'll pass on to Claire.
Thanks very much. I mean, literally 30 seconds, I promise to finish. It's really just to summarise the opportunities that we see here in Wales, and Ed and Nina have been brilliant at kind of giving a flavour of the sorts of things that are going on. There is no doubt that the new commission coming out of the Tertiary Education and Research Bill, with civic mission enshrined as one of the 9 strategic duties, is a key driver and lever for us, which is fantastic. We've also talked about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is unique across the UK nations, but is a key focus across all aspects of society. Approaches to doing things, really important, that idea of co-production and systems leadership. We do have opportunities to create capacity in terms of developing and delivering the civic mission agenda by having a really strong partnership focus. You know, we don't have to do everything ourselves. And of course, in Wales, we have the Civic Mission University Network and Framework for Wales. We can share the link in the chat for that as well, perhaps, which has been developed with Universities Wales for all universities to engage in. But a key message is, yeah, let's take some risks and let's be bold, because there are some huge social, economic, cultural challenges out there, and universities have a part to play in order to make things better across the board. Thanks very much, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you, Claire, Ed and Nina, for what was a really comprehensive and, as mentioned in the chat here, some exciting and inspiring work happening across Wales in the civic landscape. If anyone's got any burning questions for our Welsh colleagues, please do put it in the chat now, or let me signal somehow to me, but put it in the chat. But I think, you know, certainly sitting here in England, the policy landscape in Wales is, I sit here with envy at things with such foresight, like the Future Generations Act and the work that is going on. So it's a really inspiring landscape in Wales, and I think we can all learn from. I was pleased that Ed in particular and Claire at the end there really did touch on some of the challenges, because, you know, you could be forgiven for thinking things were really smooth and all happening extremely well in Wales, and yet here we're having quite a bit more challenge getting traction on the civic side of things, I think, with government here than we would desire. You know, we very much try to present universities as a partner, a potential conduit in which to deliver government objectives, and it's not always the most successful conversation, I think, not to depress everybody on a Monday morning. But, you know, just one quick question, I think, is, you know, what you have got a lot going on in the policy landscape that does endorse the civic approach, and a lot happening within the universities to embrace that. But what is potentially the biggest barrier to this work being successful? And Claire, if I could put you on the spot with that one, and then we will go to Scotland and then come back to that.
I think the biggest barrier could be universities. I can't believe I'm saying this as the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at a university. You know, we kind of have to be humble in this work, divest ourselves of the trappings of academia. And as I said, in terms of our approach at Wrexham Glyndŵr, this is about partnership, but it's not about doing two. It's about working with and being a servant of our communities. And that takes quite a mind shift for many colleagues who work at universities. So I'll leave it there, and I'm sure we can talk about that later on.
No, I think that's a really good point, Claire. I think you're absolutely right. And I think the other challenge potentially is we have to make sure that the terminology doesn't become, you know, we don't sort of move on from civic and, you know, whatever the next sort of fad phrasing is, like levelling up might be considered here, you know, that we don't sort of move on and then forget the sort of great work that's happened in this space. There is a question in the chat just from Alison McMillan talking about the importance of future generations in a way, you know, as a consequence of global warming, I should say, and how the sort of day-to-day infrastructure needs to change, and how can we sort of implement, I think, sort of initiatives to deal with some of these big global challenges through the sort of lens of the civic mission. And Nina, you seem to be waving your hand at me eagerly.
No, because it's a very good question. It's one of the biggest challenges we've got in the future, isn't it, now and in the future? And I think we have enabled that through some of the work we've done with, we hosted with lots of partners, 120 children coming together across all the region to do a host of TEDx talks for all of them to come in and talk about global warming, climate change, what are the issues that matters to them and affects them. We took that to COP26, but also to the Public Service Board, which are all your key partners, Natural Resources Wales, Health, local authorities, big decision makers, to say these are the asks, and they were brilliant because we coached them in the way to share your story. And then the other thing we're doing is we work really closely with the Public Service Board. I think that's the biggest catalyst for change for me in the civic mission space, with Natural Resources Wales, to really enable a movement for change around the environmental agenda and how we get that in everybody's psyche daily. So we are working like really strongly in that space, particularly with the Public Service Boards, being data driven and story driven and doing action around it. They're the key imperatives, I think, around this, and we're enabling it in lots of different ways across the region.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nina. I think that's really important. Civic can be quite a nebulous term, so if you can ground it in sort of policy issues and challenges that people can relate to, it's really important. So thanks very much to Claire and Nina and Ed. We will talk more about Wales later, but right now we're going to stop in Wales. We're going to put on our coats and we're going to go up to Scotland, where I'm sure it's sunny. And I'm really pleased now to welcome Lesley, Professor Lesley McAra, who's the director of the Edinburgh Futures Institute and the assistant principal for community relations at the University of Edinburgh. Lesley's going to be joined with Des McNulty. Des is a long friend of the Civic University Network, part of our partners group, but also an honorary fellow on civic partnership and place leadership at the University of Glasgow. So over to Lesley and Des now to take us through. And I think, Des, you are kicking us off. Is that correct?
Yep, thanks very much, Natalie. So we've kind of split this up between us. I'm going to talk about the policy context in Scotland and then talk about approaches to civic mission at Glasgow. Lesley will then pick up on Edinburgh and focus on some of the challenges and opportunities. We want to kind of pick up on those three sort of sub points in the middle: collaboration with civic partners, the collaboration with community organisations, and collaboration between institutions. And that very much reflects, I think, what we've heard from Wales as well. There's some considerable commonalities. If we move to the next slide. So this, can't quite see the top here, but basically it says inclusive growth and levelling up, 2 governments, 2 policies, two city regions. If you look at the left-hand side here, this is the inclusive growth policies of the Scottish government. And on the right-hand side, we've got some of the things that are coming out of the UK government's levelling up white paper. So as in Wales, we're dealing with 2 governments who are in a sense trying to deal with similar sorts of issues in different ways, but obviously with jurisdictional differences in terms of the allocation of responsibilities. In Scotland, there's a clear focus from the Scottish government on inclusive growth, on trying to link together productivity issues and economic development issues with social issues and health issues, and trying to find a way of promoting what they're calling inclusive growth. The UK government has come in with the Levelling Up white paper. Obviously, the research funding for Scotland, as in Wales, comes through the UK government rather than the Scottish government. And what they're identifying is, in a sense, areas of strength. So areas of strength in the Glasgow-Edinburgh Central Belt include life sciences, data, AI, and strong university institutions. There's another sectoral cluster in the northeast with different strengths identified. But Scotland is a very unbalanced country in some respects. There are widespread health and economic disparities, particularly from the west of Scotland relative to the east of Scotland. If we look at Edinburgh, the productivity and income is well above the UK average, whereas Glasgow has a long legacy of kind of concentrated child poverty. 35% of the child poverty in Scotland is in Glasgow. Lowest life expectancy in the UK, just about, and low household income. So in a sense, we've got a concentration of social disadvantage in the west of the country, of a large volume, but I'm sure Lesley will point out that there are significant pockets of disadvantage in Edinburgh as well, and obviously in the wider city region. So it's complex environment, two governments, two sets of policies, two city regions, both of which have got very significant city deals, and that's actually been a big kind of point from which we've moved into the civic agenda rather differently in Glasgow and Edinburgh. Glasgow City Deal was 2014. Edinburgh's City Deal was 4 or 5 years later. And in Edinburgh, the university was able to get much more closely involved in the design of the City Deal, whereas in Glasgow, we've been involved very much in the strategic implementation and in the evaluation of the City Deal. Move to the next slide, please. So this is really about universities about the National Performance Framework and missions. So here's some of the policies that the Scottish Government has put forward. We don't have a legislative framework or the Wellbeing Act that you've got in Wales. What we have is a National Performance Framework, a series of identified policy priorities that the Scottish Government has set out. We've been very early, I think, in Scotland into the missions idea. So inclusive growth is one of the government's missions, and these missions are replicated in many ways at that city region level. So net zero is a mission, dealing with child poverty is a mission, raising educational attainment for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. And the way that articulates into university policies is through outcome agreements. There are separate outcome agreements for each university, and universities are expected to contribute to these overarching aspirations that are set out in the National Performance Framework. National Performance Framework is intended to measure progress or lack of progress across the objectives set by government for itself, but then that feeds into the outcomes that are set for the sector and then for individual institutions. But probably compared with Wales, there's less kind of coherent space, if you like, for the university sector. I don't think the Scottish Government has taken the universities quite into the core of delivering some of its objectives that perhaps it has in Wales, although arguably we're more involved in it than universities in England. So we operate in a kind of almost an intermediate space in that regard. Move to the next one. Next slide. So this is about universities anchor institutions. This will be familiar to everybody. All universities, I think, would see themselves as anchor institutions. But what I wanted to kind of flag up here is that we do make significant impact on across a range of things. So on the culture of the economy, on economic progress or lack of progress, on the physical and environmental space. I mean, Glasgow and Edinburgh are both institutions that are actually got big investment strategies. So we are making a significant contribution at space. And I think we are becoming more actively involved in the development of the city. As I say, I sit on the Commission for Economic Growth, which is chaired by the principal of the university. We're involved in the Social Recovery Task Force. We're involved in a whole series of activities in the cultural space, etc., etc. So at civic level, the universities have very proactively got involved. I want to give you 4 examples of how we got involved from Glasgow. First one being the Glasgow Riverside Innovation District. So move to the next slide. So we had a dialogue between the university and its key partners about how to advance collaboration around Glasgow's science innovation audit, particularly because we were spending £1 billion on our campus, and there was 1.13 billion Glasgow Region City Deal. And what we wanted to do is create a supportive ecosystem to encourage innovation and focus that in not just on white coat technological success and bringing in new companies, but also the inclusive growth challenges that the city faces. So what we have is leading edge research at the university, imaging, precision medicine, quantum technologies, all being developed around the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. And we wanted to link that to the redevelopment of Govan, which is one of the most deprived areas of Scotland. And that in turn has become linked into the wider Clyde Mission project being led by Scottish Government. And now the Innovation Accelerator, which is being funded by the UK government. So I'm going to show you a series of maps now that kind of illustrate what we're doing. Just pass through these very quickly. Next slide, please. So here's some of the district anchors: the university, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, the SEC, which is a major, and there's a Creative Clyde quarter here. So the question was, how do we bring these together and link them in with a redevelopment strategy? Next slide. Here's the cultural sites that are in this space, north and south of the river. Next slide. Here's the public realm improvements, which has been funded by the 1.13 billion city deal. Then the next slide shows, if you like, the institutions and the physical developments that are going in here. So these are the main items in the site. Here's the hospital, the university, the SEC on a map. And here, the final slide on this is, in a sense, the deprivation map. So Govan is the most deprived area in the city. In fact, it's the most deprived area in Scotland. So one of the things about the Innovation District is, how do you link the economic prosperity and the institutional investments north of the river with those south of the river, and then bring about some kind of a economic transformation for people south of the river. Next one I wanted to talk about is COVID response and recovery. The university recruited 800 volunteers to staff the Lighthouse laboratory. We tried to get people into local jobs. There's quite a significant number of jobs have been created in Govan and set a pathway in place. There's efforts to bring that into the school sector, which mirrors some of the things that are happening in Wales. We found that actually getting involved with the whole COVID situation and the recovery has actually kind of cemented and enhanced our relationships with our civic partners, particularly Glasgow City Council and some of the other councils in the wider area, but also with community organisations. Because what they need is support from the university in preparing the city regions' economic and social recovery plans, in looking at resilience and finding new ways of addressing grand challenges such as inclusive growth, improved well-being, increased prosperity, and the climate emergency. And what we're really interested in is how we can help these people in practical terms. It's not about just about getting their policies or our policies into the correct space. It's actually about helping people to deliver. On net zero and sustainability, we have our own kind of campus and university plan for sustainability, which are linked to the city's ambitions for net zero and to global development goals. But what can we actually do? Well, we can mobilize research capacity internally and on a cross-institutional basis to contribute to innovative climate action. We've got a big research program on this, Gallant, 10.22 million that we've got from NERC. We're working with civic partners and communities through the Centre of Sustainable Solutions to help them achieve year-on-year reductions in carbon emissions by specific projects, for example, on flooding or biodiversity. We're collaborating with civic and community partners to ensure that efforts to reduce emissions and achieve sustainability don't impact on the most disadvantaged people. So how does climate action fit in with social justice? And then finally, we're using the UN Sustainable Development Goals as benchmarks to assess our progress and link our actions with those taken city and city region level. And actually, we've been very successful in that. The latest THE Sustainable Development Goals impact assessment, so that's been really successful. And then the final point I wanted to make was actually the importance of students in all this. So a substantial strand of our community engagement is led and delivered by students through Students' Representative Council and Clubs and Sciences, a whole range of different activities through which students volunteer. And that, in a sense, builds up the student skills and also the links that the university has. And staff are involved in different community engagement activities as well. So there's a big move, in a sense, from if you like, at the ground level within the universities amongst students and staff to get engaged with community organisations and to find out how they can help, how they can assist, how they can use their resources, and in the process develop their own skills. So that gives some kind of a flavour of what we're trying to do in Glasgow. And I'll hand over at that point to Lesley, who'll talk to us about Edinburgh.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Des. And I'm going to try and share my screen. We had a slight technical problems this morning, and I'm hoping that this is going to work and we'll be there. Could you just somebody say whether you can see that? I can't see anybody now.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Well, thanks. So I'm going to talk a bit about Edinburgh and then sort of just some challenges, and at the end I'm going to round up with that. And actually many of the themes that have come across from Wales are also reflected in Edinburgh as they are in Glasgow. And I think there's been some really inspiring things I've heard this morning, and lots of learning to be done too. So thanks very much to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. So what are we doing at Edinburgh? I'm the Assistant Principal Community Relations. I've just stuck a slide here about our history, and I'm not going to go through this, but I think the reason I wanted to put this up is that, I mean, Edinburgh has always seen itself as a civic university, and whether it's been effective as a civic university or not is something that we need to carefully evaluate. But I think the purpose of this slide is, I suppose, is to demonstrate that civic, in my view, a civic mission gets the best traction if you can infuse absolutely all aspects of core business. So it's got to infuse, not a third mission, it infuses research, it infuses engagement, it infuses innovation, it infuses operations, core operations, and it infuses all of our communities of staff and of students. So if you can actually infuse it across, that's when you're most likely to get traction. And in Strategy 2030, which is the university's current strategy, we've got a big mission statement there, our vision to make the world a better place. So we'll ensure our actions and activities deliver positive change locally, regionally and globally. And one of my roles is actually to translate some of these very fine words into actual practical action that actually has traction and positive impact. So Des was mentioning the saying that Edinburgh was the city that was more prosperous than Glasgow, but actually there are many pockets of urban deprivation within Edinburgh and actually in the surrounding region as well. So the left-hand side, this comes from my own research, the left-hand side is a map of the city of Edinburgh, and the darker areas are the areas where there are constellations of inequalities, constellations, multiple disadvantage. So you get a Pentagon effect within Edinburgh. And on the right-hand side is a particular small town in Midlothian, and showing aspects of disadvantage there in the darker areas, or aspects of disadvantages measured by census data. And the thing for me that is a real challenge for universities in terms of a civic mission is actually trying to transform these maps, working in partnership with others and communities to transform those maps, because these maps have been reproduced generation after generation after generation. And there's been lots of inward investment and lots of attempts at trying to transform these maps, but they have never succeeded. And I think that is one of the really big challenges that we face now, is actually how to work more effectively with others and bring the weight of the university and what the university can contribute to the wider mission to try and transform these maps. So that to me is a really important thing, is how do we make a difference and how do we work with others to change these things? So that's the problem to be solved. So at Edinburgh, the two dimensions I want to mention here, we have now a community plan with 32 specific commitments. We had initially a community strategy, and now this is a delivery plan, and we developed this plan in collaboration with the local communities. We did a lot of consultation with the communities. We also did a lot of consultation across our own communities, across students and staff. There are different dimensions of this. We are supporting social impact, and we are trying to, it's one of our ambitions, and we're trying to do this through three really big thematics. One is about supporting digital inclusion, one is about tackling homelessness and rough sleeping, and then the third one is tackling the multiple inequalities. Of course, some of these are all intersecting problems, so we're trying to develop projects that will support that, and there are a raft of different projects that I could mention, but I don't have time today. We're trying to take that forward in practical ways. We're committing to sharing our knowledge experience. We are giving staff, staff have a paid day of volunteering that they can take now, and when we have 13,000 staff, that is actually quite a lot of resource that we are trying to put into the community. We're trying to develop our alumni relations better so that our alumni community can also connect better with the local community, and also supporting open learning as well, a sort of life course approach to learning, trying to open up our the learning to the wider community at all stages in the life course. We want to build close connections to the community through things like we are involved with the community councils, we have representation on community councils, we work actually very closely with community planning, we have Doors Open Day where we open the doors to the university to the wider community, and we're also a university of sanctuary like many on the call will be. And a particular aspect of our work at the moment is actually working on trying to support Ukraine and working as a university sanctuary in that capacity, and that brings together the Ukrainian work, actually brings together some of the global and international dimensions of our work together with the local, which is really, I think, is a strength. We want to provide services to our communities, so we are opening up our sports facilities, obviously our museums, we have student social enterprise, we have free legal advice service for communities, we have a counselling service that's open to communities, and many other things. So providing services to our communities, and then opening up the estate when it's possible and safe. So COVID slightly undermined this ambition, but we want to have a physical front door in each campus. We want to enable community bookings of rooms so that the community can use our rooms. And we also want to have no surprises for university planning, because one of the tensions between the university and the local community has been around, different buildings that we've had or student accommodation. One of the things we've done in the community plans, we have a community grant scheme where local community groups can apply for some funding. So we've got about 250,000 additional for our local organisations. So we give small pots of money to do small things in the community. For example, we have a project in Leith, which is about supporting children to grow vegetables and fruit, those kind of things, that they get little bits of money to support that kind of activity. So those are some of the things that we're doing in our community plan. I want to give one example, one specific example, which is a student-based project, which sort of indicates how this flows through quite a lot of, it's both responsive to the community, but also flows through research and also student education. We were approached by the City Council and the police, local police, community police, to see if we could think up with the local community a design-based solution to the problem of antisocial behaviour in a specific square in Edinburgh, which had all sorts of lots of people who were homeless would gather there. They were the square itself was actually looking very messy and very littered and smelly, and there were redundant toilets, redundant phone boxes. It was an area that was not of civic pride, but one which was right in the heart of the tourists. So we brought together, two researchers brought together students. We considered some of the challenges here, and we worked and took the students out. They spoke to the local community, local businesses, tourists. They also spoke to the people who were supposed to be causing the antisocial behaviour. And then they created designs, which we then showed in a public exhibition. And some of those designs were then implemented as a way of trying to design a space where there would be more pro-social behaviour, recognising that ban only moves the problem somewhere else. And that also then shows how we connect into our wider work around homelessness. We have a homeless and inclusion centre, which is Inclusion Health Centre, which is intending to support people who are experiencing homelessness into better health and to tackle some of the problems, the underlying structural problems that reproduce the problems of homelessness. And so we link these kind of responsive things into this wider, more longer term and strategic initiative, which is aimed at dealing with the wider problem. So that's one example. The other thing that Des has mentioned is that Edinburgh University is heavily involved in the city region deal. And this is one of the main ways, and one of the ways which we'll be taking forward many aspects of our civic mission. So the Edinburgh and South East Scotland's city region deal involves all the local authorities around Edinburgh, Lothians, Fife, Borders, and Edinburgh City itself. As Des was saying, the universities actually in the city were much more heavily involved than many other city deals in terms of shaping the deal itself. And our contribution is around data-driven innovation. And we've worked very closely with Heriot-Watt University here. Also, in some of the activities here, we're also working very closely with Edinburgh Napier too. We have 5 innovations hubs in the university, Edinburgh Futures Institute, which I was the former director of. I just admitted office, Bayes, Usher, Easterbush, Robotarium, and an international data facility. And these things on the right hand side are what's called the big moves, and this is related to the Regional Prosperity Fund. So this is some of the UK government funding that might be coming to the area, and these are some of the issues that we will be working with others in partnership to try and take forward around being the data capital of Europe, rethinking placemaking, about sustainable transport, regeneration of the forth, tourism and culture, supporting enterprise, reinventing healthcare and aligning skills. So a massive amount of work there that I simply don't have time to go into today that will be moving forward in this way. So I'm nearly there. I'm not going to mention that. I'm just going to go straight to critical issues because I'm very conscious that we don't have very much time. So I think one of the things, I mean, people have been talking about some of the sort of the approaches that are needed in terms of civic engagement. I think these words that I've put here on the top of this slide, I think are some of the most important. When we're working with communities and with community partners, it's really important that we actually build trust, as you all know, that we're authentic in terms of the relationships that we build, that we listen, that, as people have said already, that there needs to be a long-term commitment, and this is working in, with, through and for. There is a need to build participatory and deliberative approaches, to be action orientated but not overwhelming, because it's very easy for a university and lots of people wanting to do all sorts of things in the community to actually overwhelm communities and not necessarily listen to what the needs of the community are. We need to make sure that we reach all community members, not just the usual suspects, not just the usual people that you would partner with, but actually actively reach out to all groups, including marginalised people in the community. We need to act with humility, and we need to be collaborative, not competitive. People have mentioned this before. We need to be democratic. There needs to be ethical curation of data and future scoping, because we need to think carefully about the implications of our research and practice, and some of the major innovations that universities build through their research can actually have negative consequences for communities, and we need to be very conscious of that when we're doing that digital inclusion and digital developments can sometimes lead to other kinds of exclusion, and we need to be very, very mindful of that. We need to nurture, I think, a very diverse scholarly community of staff and students, and this is also us actually acting as institutions in ways that are important around fairness, accessibility, dignity, respect and citizenship, and perhaps developing different kinds of staff. I think one of the things that I am most clear about in terms of our city region deal commitment is that there's a need to bring together a kind of business development, academic, hybrid type of staff that doesn't necessarily fit the normal standard career development for staff, and something there. I think we need, as I've said before, this whole institution approach, that your values infuse all processes and practices and leadership too, and that it needs to infuse research, education, innovation, engagement and operations. There's a need for really good communication. Obviously, people have mentioned this already, resources and time. Time is one of the greatest gifts we can give people, and actually overcoming sometimes these perverse higher education incentives around REF, around KEF in England and Wales, and around the way in which UKRI disperses funding too. I think there's a lot more that we could actually collaboratively work together to try and change. And then there's a really important thing about the impact, the social benefits, the measurement and evaluation. Really important that we actually look at what we're doing and actually trace its impact and measure and evaluate. I just want to go back then to this other example. This is just one final example of how we're trying to put this into practice in Edinburgh. So this is a research project I'm involved in, which is about placemaking, and it's in this place in Granton Waterfront, which is in the north of the city, which is a brownfield site, but it's surrounded by communities who are in the top 5% social index of multiple deprivation in Scotland. So it's surrounded by many, many deprived neighbourhoods. And what we're doing here is a very small scale project, but doing two different dimensions. One of which is to support actual local businesses and understand local businesses' capabilities in the use of social media platform data, tools and strategies to help them actually engage their communities and the people that they're trying to get into their own businesses, to actually support and develop their capabilities here. So bringing knowledge here and exploring that. And then the other dimension of this is actually testing, refining and deploying tools to deepen and extend participation and engagement. So we're running a sort of inclusion laboratories here. It's actually working with the communities in that top 5% SIMD that circle this area, about trying to get them to see what their sense sense of the development is, what their needs are, and how we can support them to mobilise and be empowered to actually participate in the development process itself in community consultation. So there's just one small example of how we as a university are trying to be responsive and work in tandem with our communities. My very final slide is just the thing that actually gets me out of bed in the morning. Professor Derek Bok was the president of Harvard, and he said once, the task that awaits us is to help the university rise to the challenges it faces so that we can succeed in making the fullest use of our exceptional resources for the benefit of all humankind. And I think that's the thing that probably gets everybody on this call up in the morning, and I think it's something really important that we should hold on to. And there's a lovely picture of Edinburgh to finish with. So that's me, that's Edinburgh. So I'm going to now not share, I hope. I don't actually know. Thank you. There we are.
Thanks very much, Lesley and Des. I'm conscious of time, but I think it's been some really fantastic presentations and some really sort of full descriptions of some of the projects and the challenges and the opportunities that are happening both across Scotland and Wales today. We are going to open it up for Q&A for all the panelists. And I think you can either put your hand up, your virtual hand, or even your real hand, but preferred your virtual hand, I think one would say, or put a Q&A in the chat. There is a Q&A in the chat already from Alison McMillan, who's providing some stonking questions already in this event. And I think it's actually a question that applies applies both to Scotland and Wales, and indeed England and elsewhere. And it's about the sort of the connections of universities in dense cities, I think, to rural areas. And obviously Scotland has a very rural landscape, but as does Wales and other parts of the country. So it's sort of, Alison's question is really about how, in this case, how do Scottish universities, but I think we can also ask the question of Wales, how do you reach out to those sort of higher education cold spots, to the really rural areas, and represent their needs, and sort of not just sort of doing things to those areas, but as you say, working in partnership. So perhaps Lesley and then Claire, if you had an example, but let's keep our answers really short, team, so that we can get to other questions as well.
So two quick, and one example and a more strategic point. A strategic point is that City Region Deal is not just Edinburgh, it's Edinburgh, South East Scotland. So it is Fife, West Lothian, East Lothian and Scottish Borders. So it's not up into Highlands, but it is dealing with a lot of rural areas. So that there's that dimension of our work. So we are cognizant that we need to outreach beyond the city itself. In terms of what was my second point? The second point is an example. The second point is an example. So we have a data collaborative for children that we run with Scottish Government and UNICEF, and they have been doing, they have got a very sort of co-creative approach to developing, understanding challenges, and then how research might address those challenges, help address those challenges. And they've been working on child poverty across Scotland. So that's one example of where they've actually been reaching out to rural communities and looking at rural poverty as an example of that.
Great. Claire, how does this work in Wales?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of sort of raising aspirations piece, I mean, the Children's University is a really good example of where we're working across, starting in Wrexham, but actually moving into Flintshire as well. And I think, trying to break down voting boundaries and geographical boundaries is a really key challenge. In terms of reach, we're looking at working across North Wales. There's discussions currently with Bangor as well. So really important that as universities we kind of put any sort of marketing competition to one side, if you like, and try to work together to address those societal challenges. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the point that Alison also makes around sort of infrastructure is a very good one. And I think that's where, as universities, providing data, information, evidence to kind of lobby, whether it's, at a council level or at a government level, around where, improving infrastructure, transport infrastructure, for example, might make a difference, is a really tangible way in which we can kind of influence those sorts of policy decisions going forwards.
Great. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Lesley. There are some comments starting to come through in the chat function. One from Phil Lampert, which I think is a really important one, just about the practical limits of civic mission, because it does have quite the potential for scope creep, doesn't it, and covering all things to all people. So, I mean, Phil talks specifically about, should it support cultural expression and cultural engagement across the region, so music and art, etc. But I wonder, maybe I'm just going to allocate at whim here, unless people put their hand up to answer specific questions. But maybe Ed and Des, do you have any thoughts on the sort of practical limits of civic mission?
Yeah, I mean, I talk quite a lot about the idea of civic mission creep, where loads of things that a university does get chucked in under civic mission, and we're expected to deliver all of them equally. And one of the things we've tried to do at Cardiff over the last few years is to be quite clear about the boundaries of what we can do and what we can't do. And some of those are thematic, some of those are geographical. For example, so there was a question a moment ago about rurality and how does a university, perhaps in a very urban area, serve the more rural ones. There are things that can be done, but we're quite clear that Cardiff University's civic mission is focused on Cardiff and South East Wales, Cardiff and its sort of surrounding valleys. At one point, I think Cardiff University was talking about projects in Namibia as being part of our civic mission. And I think we've come to realise that although those projects are really important and are absolutely things that we should be doing, if you stretch the elastic of civic to include things you're doing on a different continent, it ceases to kind of be meaningful. And likewise with the question around culture, it's involvement and support for cultural activities. It's about where your expertise lies for me. So, Cardiff University is very involved with and supportive of a lot of our work in towards the Welsh language cultural events. So we support the Eisteddfod and the Erdd Eisteddfod and Welsh language festivals in Cardiff because we've got particular expertise and strengths that can contribute to that. But there may be other activities where, say, the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama down the road might be better placed to get involved with those things. So I think it's about knowing and being confident about your strengths and your particular thing. And it comes back to what I said in my presentation about only do what only you can do. And I think universities will be able to contribute far more to civic mission if they focus on where they're strong rather than trying to do everything.
Thanks, Ed. I think that's absolutely right. And I'm conscious that Lesley and Des also put their hand up, but I probably just extend the question a little bit then to also include one that's been popped in the chat there about just getting that right balance. I think there's potential for civic mission creep, but also how you get the right balance between acting locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. And I think those are quite connected. So Lesley and Des, would you like to just reflect on that if that's what your hand's up to address? Lesley first.
Oh, okay, thanks. Sorry, I thought you might go to Des first. So no, I just wanted to say something about the limitations. I think there's another limitation that's really important, is that we're universities and we're higher education institutions, and we're not a substitute for public services. And I think that's a really important point. So we're doing quite a lot of stuff, about advocacy and supporting, free legal advice, etc., and giving out community grants, but being very conscious that what we do is added value, but it's not a substitute for actually fundamentally good public services. And actually, that's one of the things that we also ought to be, we're also working closely in policy terms to actually help, infuse thinking about policy with research. So that's one thing. In terms of culture and community, I mean, Edinburgh, we are very heavily involved in the Edinburgh festivals. That is something that we get involved in. We do sort of civic work through that, through placemaking, through breaking bread, and there's various projects. So there's been a project last year on the Great Disordered Heart, which is about the Irish diaspora to Edinburgh and looking at different communities and heritage, what we mean by cultural heritage across cities. So the interesting projects can stem from that, but that's because Edinburgh is a festival city, and that kind of there's the opportunity there. I think it's really important around the sort of collaborative bit about what you're good at. There are 4 universities in Edinburgh and all have different strengths, and actually we are stronger when we all work together, and I think that's a really important thing. And some of the big funding opportunities that are coming down the line from UKRI are things that we will want to be collaborating very closely with our partner institutions in the city to actually move forward.
Right. Des, some quick thoughts.
Thanks very much, Natalie. I mean, just echoing Leslie's point, first of all, on collaboration. So I don't think any university should actually be trying to do everything itself. I think if there are other universities with other strengths that kind of work alongside with you, then that's really important. So in Scotland, Aberdeen's got a great record in terms of, you know, its work with rural areas as well as with its with the city. We've got the University of Highlands and Islands, and I know there are great colleagues in different institutions who have contributions to make, and it's just a question of finding the right people and getting them to work together. In terms of mission creep, I mean, I'm maybe less bothered about that than some other folk. I mean, you know, one of the things about particularly a big university like Glasgow, and I guess Edinburgh is the same, but actually we've got a lot of, you know, quite big universities in Scotland, a very diverse sector, is that you kind of pull up a rock and you find somebody who's got something really interesting to offer. So in a sense, if you define the civic mission too tightly, then what you do is you undermine the contribution that could be made from your different, you know, your different colleagues. I'll just give you one example of that. Glasgow's done some fantastic work on, if you like, the historical legacy of slavery, both for the university itself and also for the city, trying to uncover, you know, what happened, you know, what the legacy is in terms of place names, in terms of wealth, etc., and then looking forward to looking at reparations and moving ahead on that. Now, that's not something that could be defined in, I don't think, from the beginning into a civic mission. It's something that came out of particular expertises that we happen to have in the university and the interests of academics. And I think what we need to do is find an elastic civic mission that can take account of that. One of the things that I think is really important, and this is just my final point, is that it's very easy to kind of focus on policy. And, you know, certainly in Scotland, we could paper the walls with strategies. I mean, coming out of their ears, and I guess other folk are in the same place. Where I think our civic partners really find difficulty is actually on focusing how best to deliver things, how best to tackle child poverty, what are the best ways of dealing with well-being. And if what we can do is we can focus the expertise of our colleagues on that and how we help people to work out whether their strategies or what actually happens is the right thing, whether it's working, whether we are reducing offending behaviour, whether we are in fact likely to be able to deal with child poverty. One of the things I would kind of throw back to Nina, actually. I mean, she talked about you know, ending inequality. I don't think ending inequality is a practical proposition. I think what we can do is we can reduce inequality, or we can tackle particular aspects of inequality, or we can kind of open out different dimensions of how we deal with that. But we're never going to be able to end inequality, I don't think, unless we move to a very different type of society, which I'm not sure that the debate is there for. So it's actually framing things in terms of what can be delivered and how can we make things better with kind of fine graining on that, because that I think, you know, delivering realistic change is what our civic partners, I think, are really most interested in.
Great. Nina, I feel like you need to be able to come back here and tell us that you have a plan for ending inequality.
I think that language was based on what our partners said, not what we said in that space. And it was about actively listening to housing associations, third sector, the communities in which we're part of, we live in and we serve, through the work we do. So that, and I think, to be honest, if you're not ambitious and have that huge goal that you all understand you're part of, then actually we're always going to be tinkering around the edges with solutions we think fit the challenge. But actually our job of work really is to understand that challenge, what it means, and how we can take our part to play to make that difference to ending it. Because if we don't do that, then we'll always be plastering the wall with strategy. So for me, it's about really enabling the action through conversation. So it's more driven by the narratives, the story, the language our partners use than it is informed by the data, but less driven by the data. And I think the magic is where you bring them together.
Thanks, Nina. There are two questions in the chat that I think build very nicely on Des's comments just then. One around collaboration. I am conscious that we have spent quite a lot of the time today talking about university collaboration. And there's a really great question by our colleague and friend Philippa Allway at the Association of Colleges about the role of FE colleges and universities in this space. And this would be a perfect time for us to plug our Civic University Network report that we did with Philippa and colleagues at the Association of Colleges, which draws across the 4 nations, and perhaps Wana, we can put that in the chat. But if colleagues might reflect on the importance of collaboration between colleges and universities in this space. And the second question, so if perhaps Lesley, you're able to pick up the sort of colleges collaboration point, because I know you were keen to come back, and then perhaps Nina or Claire, there's a second point I think which also builds on Des's point about the need to think about how this, how you operationalize the Civic. So there's a further question there about how you get staff engaged in this and how that sort of relates into performance and metrics and sort of institutionalizing the Civic. So you sort of, really embed it into processes and practices. So 2 questions there because I'm conscious of time. So Lesley, do you want to talk about collaboration?
I'll talk about collaboration, but I also do want to address the second point. So collaboration that we're doing, it's really important to be working actually with all institutions of education, not just, schools as well as FE colleges. And so looking at conduits into university, supporting skills regeneration across the city region. So we're working very closely with Edinburgh College and all sorts of things around the skills agenda. And actually one of the big sets of skills that are going to be needed in the next 20 or 30 years are plumbers and electricians, because net zero will never happen unless there's that retrofit of housing, social housing, and also so there are ways in which we as a university are supporting FE colleges in terms of shaping what the skills agenda should be and then helping to deliver it. So we're doing quite a lot of work around digital inclusion, and we're working with the FE colleges in Edinburgh around that too. So we are very connected in it. It's really important as a kind of a set of educational resources to do that. I just did want to speak to the second point here, though. I think this notion of millions of strategies and and how do you mobilize staff? So I think there's both a top-down and a bottom-up dimension to this. As top-down, where you actually have some strategic goals and clear strategic goals and then a delivery plan as to how you do it. But I think the other thing that's really interesting for me is that if you, as Des was saying, if you pick up a stone, you find all sorts of amazing things happening. And especially in a university where there are 13,000 staff and 45,000 students, lots of people are working and engaged with communities, and actually you don't absolutely know everything that's happening. Now, it's a challenge to know what everything is happening. We need to have better ways of communicating that. But I would never want to kind of be so controlling from the top-down perspective that you don't allow that kind of creativity. As Durkheim says, you need a little bit of crime in order to actually have a healthy society. So you've got to kind of nurture that kind. So you need to nurture creativity more. And that actually, I think that is getting that balance right and knowing what the left hand and the right hand are doing is one of the big challenges.
And actually, can I just add to that? I mean, I really like Nina's point about listening to people and storytelling. So I think one of the ways in which you engage with people in the university is actually by storytelling about what other people are doing. So communicating what civic engagement we're actually doing. But I think the other side of that is actually listening to what our civic partners want and listening carefully to what they want. Because sometimes we think we've got the knowledge and we're simply passing that knowledge on to them. Whereas actually the way it really works, I think, is when we actually are contributing to our civic partners the things that they actually want. And that can only emerge out of a conversation where we listen to them and they listen to us about what's possible and what we can deliver. So I think that whole process of engagement is not just a kind of diplomatic process, it's a conversational process that needs to reach deep into what each other can do.
Claire, I'm conscious you're keen to come in there.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on the incentivizing staff point, which I would say no. People gravitate to this work because they see a need to be involved in tackling these grand challenges. I'm not really into setting individual targets and KPIs for people. I think, the kind of challenge speaks for itself. So the draw certainly for our colleagues at Wrexham Glyndŵr is around being useful, about being part of something that's about change. It's about, real challenges on the ground, often within the communities in which our colleagues actually live, let alone working within those communities, and actually making a difference. And the second point I make is that we've actually, within the university, we've kind of put our money where our mouth is, if you like, and we've implemented aspects of our civic mission strategy within the university as a community within itself. So, for example, our work around systems leadership, we have a distributed approach to rolling out a lot of this work, which cuts across academic and professional staff colleague boundaries. The keeping healthy strand is incredibly important, as I know it is for many universities now. And as Nina said, we are working towards being the first trauma and adverse childhood experiences informed university across the UK. So, this isn't just work that we are working in partnership and talking with, partners about across our communities and region. We are actually, kind of walking the talk, if you like, within our own university. And that's incredibly powerful in terms of an incentive and actually drawing people in to that work.
Brilliant. Thanks, Claire. I'm just conscious of time because we only have, a minute or so left. So I do think it's probably the time now to sort of to pause on the Q&A, but to just, as chair, to thank you all for what has been a really rich morning of presentations, but also Q&A. I think we did pack in quite a lot of questions just in that last point, that last time. So just, on behalf of the Civic University Network, really a huge thanks to all our speakers, to Lesley, to Des, Nina, Claire and Ed. Huge thanks, and also to our translators for stepping in and helping to translate today's event for all our colleagues. We will be putting up the slides, and the event will be live, and it'll all sort of come out on the Civic University Network. So feel free to relive the morning if you've enjoyed it very muchly, and watch it all again. So huge thanks to our speakers. There are, of course, as always, in the Civic University Network, a number of events coming up. Please do join us. We've got a week of activities happening in June, which is up on the screen. You can find out more on the website. There's also lots of resources on the website. As mentioned, reports that do tackle the sort of differences in the four nations in terms of the collaboration between HE and FE, but also things like a sort of policy mapping tool and other things that do try to look at where civic is embedded, or where there are potential opportunities for civic engagement and activity across the four nations. So please do jump on in. If you haven't already signed up to the newsletter, please do. And I think that's all the things that I need to plug at the end of this event. But once again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to our speakers. It's been a great morning, and we look forward to seeing you and to picking up these conversations at future events. So thanks very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.